thanks very much for having me this evening. Really always great to be with the IPSC and people from Ireland, and I guess especially at this very nightmarish moment where we see the genocide not only back on but escalated. Israel and the U.S. Really kind of going to what has by some commentators been called the final solution of Gaza. I thought what I'll do is first start, I'll speak a little bit about the BNC and my role within the BNC, and then go into some of the work that we're leading along with partners like IPSC and others around the world in terms of kind of trying to change policy. I'll speak about the Apartheid Free Zones, but also how it links to that kind of more strategic, long-term kind of work. And maybe kind of at the end also, as I was told by colleagues and comrades, that it'd be good to touch on what to do immediately as we see the Israel-US genocidal axis escalating, death and destruction in Gaza, but also here in the West Bank where I'm based, and how that also kind of needs to be balanced with something more long-term. So the BNC is short for the Palestinian BDS National Committee, and it was formed 2 years after the 2005 call to boycott Israel, divest from Israel, and impose sanctions against Israel until the realization of the Palestinian inalienable rights to self-determination and the right to return, right to equality. Basically, the dismantling of the settler-colonial regime of apartheid and illegal occupation. So very much a call that is grounded in international law. We'll come to that in a little bit. And the BNC is the largest coalition in Palestinian civil society, whether at home here in colonized Palestine or in forced exile. It is made up of coalitions, unions, federations, associations, and so on, that are basically people's organizations of the grassroots. Just to kind of like name a few of the members of the BNC, it includes the Council of National and Islamic Forces in Palestine, the General Union of Palestinian Workers, the Federation of Independent Trade Unions, the Palestinian NGO Network, which is the largest network of NGOs, and so on. You could check out on our now new website about the BNC and the members of the BNC. The way that the BNC works is by building consensus around what are, for example, the criterias for choosing, devising a campaign, running a campaign, the policies and kind of the principles on which the movement is anchored on. For example, being anti-racist, against all forms of discrimination, and also the building of consensus. And this is primarily work that is done in Palestine and the Arab world around anti-normalization. Basically, the work that counters the normalizing of the settler colony of Israel and the building of relations with it, whether it is cultural, academic, or political at the official level. The BNC tries as much as possible to organize conferences every year or a couple of years, whereby there is a democratic renewal of kind of the organizing. So if you want kind of the council of all the federations and unions is the General Assembly of the committee, basically the committee, which is the General Assembly, which kind of elects during the conference a secretariat that is the executive. Part of the secretariat is the international secretariat that looks at work that is done outside, the solidarity and the ending complicity, the relations with partners and so on, all around the world. And of course, there's much of the work that is being done here in Palestine. Anti-normalization is part of it, but also kind of the building of people power. We have and have been developing and growing, for example, BDS clubs in the universities in the West Bank and Gaza. We work a lot with schools, school children on boycott and how they can build and implement campaigns, but also with the municipalities all across where we're able, given kind of the situation and apartheid, to be able to work without risk or posing risk to those who are involved. Every year the secretariat is elected, and the secretariat, what it does is then, and this is all kind of voluntary, the kind of the membership of the council, the meetings, the secretariat, or here the executive and the international secretariat are all volunteers, but the volunteers come and bring people who can lead on campaigns, whether thematic, like, for example, myself working on policy level, I'll come to explain that, or, for example, people who are able to work on a military embargo, in particular tech and human rights, or tech for apartheid, and then regional. So I have colleagues in each of the regions around the world. There's a colleague that looks at the Arab world, another at Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, North America, Asia Pacific, and so on. So this is kind of like the structure, and of course, BDS is a movement. It's a movement of people, and that includes BDS groups, like, for example, BDS Malaysia, BDS South Africa, or the BDS coalition in South Africa, but also, for example, the Irish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, Palestine Solidarity Campaign in the UK, Jewish Voice for Peace in the US, and so on. And there are also unions and other kind of big organizations that have endorsed or signed up for BDS, or do actually carry out kind of BDS work as such, as organizations or as unions. So that's, I mean, I'm happy to come to, if there are any questions around BNC later. And as I said, the work and the movement is grounded in international law. It calls for the realization of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people as defined under international law. But most recently, we've seen very significant developments that have made it acutely clear not only the situation in Palestine, meaning Israel's apartheid, for example, as determined by the International Court of Justice, the highest world court, or the illegality of its presence, both the military occupation and illegal settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories, but also the plausibility of genocide that Israel is carrying out in Gaza. But it's also made acutely clear the responsibility of third states and corporations towards Israel's criminality, crimes, and illegal occupation, apartheid, and genocide. And here I want to bring kind of a paraphrase, really, rather than a quote by Craig Mukhaybar, who was the UN's top official, human rights official in New York. He headed the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights that is based in New York, who resigned in November of 2023 in protest against the UN's inaction towards Israel's genocide supported by the West and the US and other Western countries. Wrote a very powerful letter that we have on our website, but we could also share, that in the wake of the International Court of Justice advisory opinion on the illegality of Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territories and the obligation on third states not to recognize such an illegal situation or render aid or assistance to it, Craig Mukhaybar said BDS is now, it's very clear that BDS is international law. It's an international legal obligation. And indeed, if you come to look at the work that BDS is doing, the campaigns, whether it is the boycott campaigns, the divestment campaign, or the works on the S level, it is really based on what has come very clear from the ICJ on two main levels. With regards to genocide, it is to ensure that there is no complicity in genocide, but also the responsibility to prevent genocide, meaning that if you know there is a risk of genocide and you have the power, whether as a state institution, corporation, to prevent that genocide, then you must do what you can to ensure that the genocide is prevented. Now, if you have a relation, like, for example, the supplying of weapons, the transit of weapons, the providing of dual-use materials, the providing of energy, for example, as a state like Israel, supported by the West, is carrying out a genocide in Gaza, then there is a legal obligation to end that complicity. Otherwise, there is a risk of criminal liability. So this is at one end what the ICJ has triggered in the ruling of provisional measures in the case that was brought by South Africa against Israel for violations of the Genocide Convention, that once the court has ruled provisional measures and has confirmed the plausibility of Israel's genocide in Gaza, then there is a clear legal obligation and responsibility on states, institutions, corporations to ensure that they do what they can to prevent genocide. The other legal obligation arising from the International Court of Justice advisory opinion on the legality or the legal consequences of Israel's illegal presence is, and the finding that Israel is guilty of apartheid, that Israel is violating Article 3 of the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which basically prohibits apartheid and racial segregation. The court found Israel in violation of that, and therefore apartheid is not to recognize apartheid or Israel's illegal presence in the occupied Palestinian territories, but also to ensure that the state, but also state organs and institutions are not rendering aid or assistance to Israel's illegal regime. And that can include trade, it could include the supply, of course, it includes the supply of weapons, the direct material that is used in the maintaining of a legal situation, but also trade, whether it is the sending of commodities, the buying of commodities, maintaining agreements is violating the obligation not to recognize an illegal situation, for example, and so on. And so that in general is and really very briefly, and again, happy to go into that in detail, is the framework of international law which guides the BDS work more generally, but particularly the work on sanctions, and that is the S in BDS. The S comes after the B and the D because that speaks to the theory of change, that only through building people power that we're able to change policies, and the change of policy is at a government level, at a regional body level, at the international organizations like the UN, for example, but also at the local government level. And it can happen through the building of legislation, a legislation that ensures, for example, not recognizing an illegal situation as legitimate, or legislation that ensures that a state is not rendering aid or assistance by, for example, maintaining trade treaties, of ensuring or facilitating, for example, the transit of commodities or weapons or energy to that criminal entity. So legislation at the parliamentary level. It can also include the work and the push for instituting policy at the government level or local government level, and we'll come to some of the strategies that we've been working on along with, for example, IPSC and others around the world in terms of ethical procurement and ethical investment policies. that can be passed through a resolution. It could also, of course, come through legislation, but it can also be measures that are taken by the governing body, the government itself, or local governments, or, for example, specific authorities. And I'll be happy to also kind of speak about some of the work that we've been doing along with partners across the Mediterranean to ensure that the boats carrying weapons, dual use, and energy to Israel are not allowed to use the ports or territorial waters. And that can come, for example, by instituting measures at that authorities level. So the port authority can sometimes, in some contexts, take such decisions to pass, institute a measure. But also kind of policy change can come through litigation. And we've seen, some examples in Europe and elsewhere where companies have been taken to court, or even the threat of litigation has kind of created some change at the policy level. So that can be also a way of changing policy. Now, in terms of, and I guess it comes here, and I'll come to apartheid free zones at the end of this, since some of the strategies that we've been working with partners in kind of pushing includes the ethical procurement policies. This is basically looking at how again, kind of various levels, but with a focus at local authorities, local councils, cities, municipalities, and so on, is in how they may be able to adopt policies that ensure that they don't procure from companies that are complicit in human rights violations and violations of international law, particularly in light, with regards, it could be universal, so it doesn't have to be specific to Palestine. And I think this is one of the things that allow for opportunities to build intersectional alliances with other struggles for freedom, justice, equality, self-determination, and so on, including, for example, climate change and environmental justice groups, that the policy really targets, the procuring from companies that are complicit or involved in human rights violations and violations of international law. And we have as really an excellent start. And I believe it's only a start because it can only grow databases to measure against. And one of these databases is a UN database that is held by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, after being instituted by the Human Rights Council. And this is a database of companies that are involved in Israel's illegal settlements, for example. We have a database of companies that are complicit in genocide, that is researched and regularly updated by AFSC, the American Friends Society. I can't remember what the C stands for. But basically the Quakers. There is a wonderful work that is done by an organization called Who Profits, that looks at also the companies that profit from Israel's illegal occupation and settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories. And there's, of course, kind of the targeted campaigns that are run by BDS. And these provide kind of a very good body of lists and databases on which can provide the start from when discussing and pushing for an ethical procurement policy. The other one is the ethical investment policy. Thank you, Kevin. American Friends Service Committees. And I can also kind of share later, or we can follow this with kind of the links directly to kind of like the databases and the list of companies and so on. The other one is the ethical investment policies. And again, this is looking at state affiliated, for example, bodies that do investments. This could include pension funds. It can include sovereign funds, but you do also have some local government that does investment, some regional bodies that do investment, and so on. And what the strategy tries to advocate for is that investment should also ensure that they do not contribute to human rights violations or violations under international law, ensure that are within the framework of the UN guidelines of business and human rights. That, for example, especially at the time of genocide, that these investments are not contributing to companies, bodies, or states. Sometimes, because you have investment in bonds, including Israeli bonds, and we've seen recently, for example, the Norwegian the Norwegian sovereign fund divest from Israel bonds. The strategy basically tries to push for doing that, and at the heart of the strategy is basically adopting a policy. So it's not so that it's one-time thing. It is a long-term strategic kind of change that we are seeking. And I guess here is a good time to kind of talk about this kind of balance between kind of the long term and the short term, because in a lot of this work, it takes a lot of time. It sees a lot of energy, especially because it is Palestine. That perhaps in other contexts where there are violations of international law and human rights, there was quicker action, particularly by Western institutions and organizations and states. For example, Russia comes to mind, Myanmar as well, where action was a lot more swifter. There is a lot of hypocrisy and double standards when it comes to Palestine and Israel, and this is reflected in how much states and state organizations and institutions like local bodies and so on react, even though the evidence of complicity and involvement and contribution to genocide, apartheid, illegal occupation, systematic human rights violations, and so on is very clear. I think perhaps Palestine is one of the places where there is a very well-developed regime, if I might call, kind of a human rights regime of documentation and reporting, whether it is by very professional local human rights organizations. Al-Haq is one, Damir when it comes to prisoners, and others that do really amazing work in terms of documenting and reporting on Israel's violations, but also Israeli organizations as well, B'Tselem, Yeshdin, and so on. That is part, if you want, of that regime. You have numerous UN bodies that also do this documentation and reporting. There are human rights mechanisms. There's a special rapporteur that has a mandate that is specific to the occupied Palestinian territories. Of course, this is now Francesca Albanese. But you also have thematic special rapporteurs or mechanisms. For example, the special rapporteur on the right to food, the special rapporteur on the right to housing, and so on and so forth, that also do look, and given the severity, especially given the severity, even before the genocide of Israel's criminality, that you have a focus of these special mechanisms on Israel. And so there's that level of documentation. There are also sometimes special investigative committees. Right now, we have an ongoing commission of inquiry that was appointed by the Human Rights Council that is looking at all human rights violations and violations of international law in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, that has been doing work since 2022. You also have bodies within the UN General Assembly. You have the Special Committee to investigate Israeli practices in occupied Palestinian and Arab territories, and so on and so forth. Basically, the point here to make is that there's this very developed extensive kind of body that is producing documentation, showing the facts, and reporting on the facts to international bodies that do reach states, whether it's the foreign ministries or the offices of the Prime Minister and so on. And so it is the situation on the ground is very clear, and therefore also, and as the International Court of Justice has made clear, it is very clear what third states and state bodies, what their obligations towards these crimes and violations must be, right? And again, kind of going back to when it comes to genocide, it's the ensuring that there's no complicity, prevention, and when it comes to apartheid and illegal occupation, is not to recognize or render aid and assistance. Yet we see little bit of action, particularly in the global south. But when compared, and especially in the global north, when compared to other situations, the hypocrisy and double standards come very glaringly clear. So, kind of going back, this is long-term work. People may think, okay, so what do I do now? As Israel, supported by the US, continues to escalate the genocide. I'm sure you've all been following the uncovering of some of the horrific massacres that have been carried out, including against humanitarian workers, medical workers, and the civil defense and so on in Gaza. The ongoing forcible displacement, whether it is in Gaza or here in the West Bank. We've seen the highest rate of forced displacement in the occupied West Bank since 1967, really, particularly in the north, in Jenin, Tulkarem, and so on. Some of the highest rates of extrajudicial executions and killings, and of course, the arbitrary detention and imprisonment and the severe torture over the past couple of years. We've seen dozens of people who were killed in Israeli prison as a result of torture and other forms of torture and abuse, including rape and so on, that has also been documented by international organizations. So what do we do now, and what do we also kind of do at the same time that ensures that there is an effect on the kind of long term, that doing may not seem as kind of responding to the urgency of the situation right now. And what we say to this is that we are, now that Israel's settler colonial regime was able to kind of reach its height in fulfilling the intention of the erasure of the indigenous people, indigenous Palestinians from our land, because of complicity, because Israel for over the past decades was not only allowed to carry out or kind of develop and further entrench its criminal system, but that it was also supported in doing so, particularly by Western powers. But not only. I think it's very important to also recognize and see in order to kind of also act against the complicity that exists also in the global south. Some of the biggest providers of Israel's energy actually come from the global south. Nigeria, Gabon, Azerbaijan, and so on are the top three providers of oil to Israel. So we reached the now kind of the full scale genocide in Gaza, and this kind of a very intense and escalated ethnic cleansing and annexation of land in the West Bank because of complicity. So in a way, this is the strategic work that we're trying to push and doing right now should have also kind of been done way long before, so that we do not get to this place. So it's always important to keep that in mind. At the same time, what do we do now to try to hinder, or for example, ultimately what we want is for the genocide to stop, are kind of tactics and strategies of disruption, of ensuring that there is no business as usual with genocide. For example, where possible, to carry out strikes, to carry out nonviolent direct action, to disrupt, for example, the flow of military, of dual use, of energy, but also to kind of continue hammering on with the pressure on governments to act on their obligations, and not to let that go. Not to allow also for the normalization of the massacre of hundreds of people. Unfortunately, we've kind of like started feeling since the resumption of the genocide, since Israel broke the ceasefire, is that somehow there's a getting used to the news of hundreds of Palestinians, including children being killed in airstrikes and so on. And we can come to kind of some of the details of how it's a difficult balance, and it's difficult sometimes to kind of like keep an eye on kind of the long term of doing kind of the strategy policy level work while we see things that are happening like this on daily basis. And this brings me kind of to apartheid free zones. And what to say, this is one of the campaigns, BDS campaigns. And apartheid free zones is, if you want, kind of spatial thinking. It's looking at a certain space and saying that I want to ensure that this space does not have any direct or indirect links with Israel's criminality, crimes, violations of international law, human rights violations, and so on. And these direct and indirect links, of course, depending on the space, can take many forms. So it could be, for example, a business that says that I will not procure, I will not buy, I will not have products of companies that are complicit in Israel's crime, or Israeli companies. I won't have any relations with companies that contribute in whichever way, for example, to the Israeli economy, because at a time of genocide, every contribution to the Israeli economy is a contribution to genocide and apartheid and so on. It could be, a cultural space, cultural organization that would refuse to have in its space, or have relations, or have partnerships and so on with other cultural organizations, dance groups and so on, that are complicit in the crimes, whether that is by kind of the whitewashing of Israel's crimes, or acting as a kind of public relation arm of the Israeli government and so on. So it's thinking kind of very locally. It's looking at my space here, and it could also be a school, it could be a shop, it could be a cultural organization, as I said, a theater, a bookshop, a barber shop, and saying that this space is clean of crime or complicity in crime. And then, as we've been kind of doing over the past year, is to say that also apartheid free zone is a journey, right? So you start by examining your own space, you kind of take it step by step. It's very context sensitive as well. So you try to see how best to kind of progress in ensuring that space is free from apartheid or complicity in apartheid and genocide, but also see how it grows. A shop can work on having its neighbor as well to announce that it is an apartheid-free zone, actually work on becoming kind of an apartheid-free zone to ensure that there is no complicity, and that grows into the street, for example, the neighborhood, and eventually, and this is where I kind of want to make the link, is to see how by building, and again, this speaks, the kind of directly to the theory of change of building people power. It's only through building people power that we're able to change policy, is by bringing it from the bottom up in this way, in a kind of a spatial manner, that you can also have apartheid-free local councils, apartheid-free cities, towns, villages, and eventually, and this is really kind of the fulfillment of the obligation, not to be complicit in apartheid, not to render aid and assistance to genocide and apartheid, is also for the state to take measures in which it ends its complicity in Israel's crimes and violations of international law, and takes measures to hold it accountable. So, apartheid free zone can be very local, but as it grows, and if you look at it as a journey where there is also kind of the active work on expanding the zone, expanding the space that is free of apartheid, that space can also reach higher, from a street to a neighborhood to a city, and eventually the country and the state itself. Let me stop here. And I know I've kind of put a lot, so I'm really looking forward to the questions and the discussion. Kind of as a recap, and to remind, if anybody had the question at the beginning, we spoke a little bit about the BNC, so I'm very happy to kind of address any questions around the BNC, the BDS, and so on. Kind of the recent determinations in international law, the judicial determinations by the International Court of Justice that were also kind of adopted by legislative bodies, including the UN General Assembly, for example, the African Union, and so on. How our work is grounded in international law, and especially recently with these determinations of Israel's criminality, but also the responsibility of states not to be complicit in that criminality, and to ensure that complicity ends and that there are accountability measures taken. This is kind of the S in BDS, the sanctions bit, which is the obligations under international law, theory of change, of building people power to change that policy, whether it is at the government level, local government, regional bodies, and so on, through legislation, policy measures, litigation, and particularly the ethical procurement and the ethical investment policies, and kind of finally, these few notes I gave around apartheid free zones. I hope this is helpful and that you found it useful, and yeah, looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.